In another, the fourth seminar of our series, Defending Against False Allegations of Sexual Abuse. In this seminar, we're going to talk about junk science. What is junk science? Well, everybody has a different idea, but for our purposes today, two hallmarks of junk science are causism and hyperclaiming. What is causism? Causism means inferring a cause when no causal relationship actually exists. For example, it was widely once believed that when a little girl had erythema of the vestibule, sex abuse had happened. That's implying a cause, sex abuse, for the symptom erythema of the vestibule. Scientific research has shown that a majority of non-abused girls have erythema of the vestibule. Let's give another example, a simpler one. Person 1 is pregnant. An examination reveals person 1 is a woman. Person 2 is a woman, therefore she must be pregnant. Pretty silly, isn't it? That's junk science. That's causism. Causism implies a cause when no causal relationship necessarily exists. In our medical example, newer research demonstrates that claims such as erythema of the vestibule equals sexual abuse have been thoroughly researched, and the causistic or junk science underpinnings of some of those claims have been described in the scientific literature. What is hyperclaiming? Hyperclaiming is going too far with data. For example, probably one of the best examples of hyperclaiming is the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Many years ago, around the time of the McMartin preschool nightmare, Roland Summit saw a number of children about whom allegations of sexual abuse had been made. In his setting, he noticed similarities. He noticed that the children he saw often seemed helpless. He noticed that the children he saw often seemed to retract allegations that they had made. He noticed a variety of symptoms in children he saw that we would expect in children who were anxious. Dr. Summit later wrote that his experience caused him to believe that if children exhibited these symptoms, sexual abuse had happened. He later denied that this was his intention. Nevertheless, he believed we can generalize from symptoms like helplessness and retraction that sexual abuse had happened. This was hyperclaiming. When behavioral scientists or mental health personnel generalize from too small a sample, it's hyperclaiming. Junk scientists gloss over or simply neglect to inform about the importance of numbers, namely lots and lots of people in a sample from which they want to generalize. Junk scientists gloss over or simply neglect to inform about base rates. They fail to inform that all of these kinds of symptoms or signs actually occur in the general population. Junk scientists often gloss over or simply neglect to inform about the difference between incidence and prevalence. This refusal to describe the basic scientific principles, or in many cases a lack of knowledge of scientific principles, are the hallmarks of the junk scientist. In our court cases, these folks are not here to help the trier of fact, they are there to make a claim. Remembering the Roland Summit example, we can see that the junk scientist gets an idea about what's happened and then works very hard to get data to support that idea. That's called confirmatory bias. Many refer to it as pursuing a single hypothesis. These agenda-driven folks tend to neglect or simply ignore data that does not contribute to their goal. They are simply driving down one road with blinders on. The child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is a classic example of junk science. All roads lead to the conclusion, he did it. Built on confirmatory bias and hyperclaiming and causism, it would be difficult to find a better example of junk science than the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. There's more information about junk science in a book that my co-author Dr. Campbell and I wrote for judges. It's called the Bench Book in the Behavioral Sciences. We spent a great deal of time trying to educate judges as to how to determine what is good science and what is bad science. Causism, hyperclaiming, and then if you want to get a little bit more in detail, validity and reliability. These are all important aspects of good science. There are many examples of junk science being used by the child advocacy movement. We're going to use the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome to demonstrate to you how to approach this type of evidence.
Over the last 2 decades, we have read transcripts of trials and watched how different lawyers have unsuccessfully struggled to handle child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Let me tell you of my own experience. About 15 years ago, I hired one of the most qualified expert witnesses in the country. He had been the chair of the Ethics Committee of the American Psychological Association. The Ethics Committee defines and enforces the standard of care for psychologists. His committee addressed issues of junk science in psychology. The prosecution called an MFCC. When the witness stated that she was going to tell the jury about the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, all of the jurors grabbed their notepads and pencils. It was obvious that they believed they were going to finally get the key to deciding the case. The prosecution witness even cried during her testimony. I looked over and saw 2 jurors with tears in their eyes. Next, my Top Gun expert testified. He testified about causism, hyperclaiming, validity, and reliability, and about the hallmarks of good science. He testified about the lack of scientific research supporting Dr. Roland Summit's child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. As a prior chemical engineer, I completely understood his testimony and its significance. The problem was the jury was not made up of 12 scientists. The jurors all appeared that they were going to sleep. The DA's approach in cross-examination was simple. Question: do children that have been molested sometimes retract? Yes. Question: do children that have been molested sometimes delay reporting? Yes. Question: do children that have been molested sometimes accommodate the adults that molest them? Answer: yes. And on through each element of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, this type of questioning went on. I debriefed the jury following the verdict. The juror's impression was that my expert was very smart and very scientific, but he had admitted to everything that Roland Summit had said. If it's true, why are you calling it junk science? Remarked one juror. Why are you making such a big deal about it? Asked another. What difference does it make? Remarked another juror. The defense had won the junk science battle, but the DA had won the war for the hearts and minds of the juror. After more than a decade of getting beat up by child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, I had a 15-second epiphany. I was working with an expert witness on attacking a police interview of a child witness. The officer was asking only questions that would prove that a molestation had occurred. The officer failed to ask any questions on the issue that the allegation might be false. Further, the officer ignored all statements by the minor that indicated that nothing had occurred. We were trying to figure out how to explain to the jury that it is not just leading questions that were suggestive. The entire interview was highly suggestive because it was a confirmatory bias interview. A confirmatory bias interview is dangerous because it is not an investigation for the truth. It begins with the belief that the truth is already known and only looks for data supporting that view. Child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is a confirmatory bias model.